All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this year as a Zichus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar Habadin Latova Shmuel Rabin Karabkin, the commission of the yahrzeit of Shmuel's father, Lipa Ben Yecheskel HaKoyin Zichron Livracha. And of course, as always, we dedicate our learning in the schus of our precious hostages, Mechadish Baruch Hu Meir Hashem. Bring them home b'shalom and b'karov, and in the schus of the success of our soldiers, Mechadish Baruch Hu, allow them to be successful. Mamish b'chol maaseh yedeim. We will say we wish a special mazel tov to Mr. and Mrs. Ruben Golian on the occasion of the chasana of their daughter last week. Mazel tov, mazel tov. Meir Hashem, the chasana and college should be zocheh to build a bayis ne'eman b'Yisrael. A home filled with mazel, bracha, simcha, natzlacha, ve'esim shanim tovos. Mazel tov. Most with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. A really interesting daf, another daf again, where we're going to highlight a number of fundamental principles which Emir Hashem will help us along the journey ahead. Today's daf is Chav Vav 26. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Chav Hey Amud Beis 25b, first wide line. Rabbi. Rabbi says as follows: Umol de Rav. Rav agrees in the following scenario. So we went through this, or I went through this a little bit too quickly at the end of yesterday's daf. So what I want to point out over here is the Gemara kind of tangentially introduced us now to a second category of Shevuah, which again, the Gemara did not formally introduce. It kind of just got brought up along the way of the journey. So remember, up until now, we have been hyper-focused on one type of Shevuah, Shevuah's bitui, which is a declarative Shevuah. Right? I'm going to do something, I'm not going to do something again. So the two paradigmatic examples are future-oriented, I will eat a loaf of bread, I won't eat a loaf of bread. That's the Shtayim, Shein Arba, which are two more cases, same Shevuah, just in past tense. I did eat a loaf of bread, I didn't eat a loaf of bread. We're in the midst of a fundamental machlokes of, does the Shevuah have to be able to go ahead and be phrased both in the future, and does it prospective and retrospective? And also sub-machlokes is, does the Shevuah have to be able to be phrased in the positive and the negative, that I will do and I won't do this act? Tangentially, the Gemara introduced us to Shevuah Sa'idos, which is a Shevuah about whether or not you know testimony for someone. Now again, don't worry, Shevuah Sa'idus is going to get its own time, it's going to get its own dapim. The Gemara is just kind of bringing it up tangentially a little bit. So now the Gemara goes on. So Rav says like this, or Ruvain says to Shimon, or I say to Ruvain, I swear I don't know testimony for you. And it turns out that he doesn't know the pater. Ultimately, he's pater. I will say pater for what? Pater for Shevuah's bitui, as we're going to say. This is not a case of Shevuah's bitui. Hoyel velese bichlal she'ini yodea lecha eidos. Because since it can't be phrased in the way of I don't know Eidos, which we'll see in just a little bit. So again, I will say, when we says pater, it means pater really that it's not a Shevuah's bitui, but ultimately, again, this does enter into Shevuah's Eidos, to which the Gemara says, Yadati velo yadati machlokes, he'arati velo he'arati machlokes. Because ultimately, again, the case of yadati velo yadati is machlokes, and he'arati velo he'arati. I did swear or I didn't swear would also be a machlokes. So b'shlam of the Shmuel, the Amar Milsa de Leisei Belahaba lo mechayva l'sha'avar. So according to Shmuel, who says that something that cannot be phrased in the prospective future version, one is not chayv for Shevuah's bitui in the past version, in the past tense version, lahachi afka rachmana l'shvuas eidos michlal Shevuah's bitui. That's why the Torah creates a separate category of Shevuah Sa'idos. El Rav, Lemay Hilchasa Afka Rachmana. But according to Rav, ultimately, who doesn't require this, why does the Torah create a separate category of Shevuah Sa'idos? To which the Gemara says, Amro Rabbana Kabeda Abaye Lechiyuve Alea Tarte. Apparently, in order to create dual liability for Shevuah Sa'idos, that you'll be chayiv both for Shevuah Sa'idos and potentially as well for Shevuah's bitui. Amar lei, that's not possible. Tarti lo matzisu amriso. You can't say that there's dual liability for one Shevuah. Why not? The sanya la'achas me'ila. When the pasuk talks about liability for a Shevuah, it says for one of these. La'achos ata mechayvo v'ata mechayvo l'shtayim. You can be chayiv only once per Shevuah, but not both. In other words, they both say, this is Dr. Gladstein brought this up to me at the end of yesterday's shir, that, when you speak about all of these Shevuahs that are done incorrectly or falsely, don't they all boil down to Shevuos Sheker, right? Assuming that there was intentionality. So isn't there dual liability? One of the principles we're going to see by Shevuos is that every Shevuah fits into a category. Every Shevuah, in other words, even though you may have commonality, but there's a distinct feature that puts the Shevuah in a particular category, specifically for Shevuos Bitoy, because remember again, Shevuos Bitoy is one of the unique categories where there is carbonic liability. There's carbon Olev Yored. Shevuos Sheker, you'll get Malkus. Shevuos Shav, you'll get Malkus. But again, so that's why the Gemara says over here, there's no such thing as dual liability. Every Shevuos fits very neatly into a category, even though there absolutely is a certain degree of overlap between some of these categories. According to Abaye, why is Shevuos Ha'edos put in its own category? By all other Shevuos in general, when is there liability? When v'ne'elam, when there's what we'll call ha'alamas Shevuah. You forgot about the fact that you took your Shevuah. V'kan lo ne'emar v'ne'elam. By Shevuos Ha'edos, interestingly enough, there's no v'ne'elam. And again, I will say, don't worry. Like I said, this is not the spot for Shevuos Ha'edos. So right now, this is really only being brought up very tangentially in a much bigger discussion. We're going to spend the time on Shevuos Ha'edos. But yet, Rabbi says Shevuos Ha'edos is unique. Why? L'chayiv ala mezid kishogeg. So Shevuos Ha'edos is purposely mentioned separately because there's a different level of liability. Shevuos Ha'edos, if you intentionally lie, right? I swear I don't know any testimony for Ruvain. I know testimony for Ruvain. I know that I know testimony for Ruvain. I'm intentionally lying. It's amazing. What's the halacha? I'm chayiv. Now this is unique because remember again, generally, for example, take Shevuos Bitoy for a second, right? I swear I'm not going to go ahead and, or better, I swear I didn't eat I swear I'm not going to eat the loaf of bread today. And I have to go out of my way to eat a loaf of bread today. I know about the Shevuah. I know about what's the halacha. What's the halacha? What am I chayiv? What am I chayiv? Interestingly enough, malchus. Because remember again, the only time you're chayiv a carbon olev yored in a case of Shevuos Bitoy is when there is he'elam Shevuah. Lapse awareness about the Shevuah. But if there's intentionality, essentially it's treated like a Shevuos Sheker, right? The Shevuah, like a false oath, and therefore there's malchus. The exception to this rule that you're chayiv complete liability even if you know about your Shevuah, in other words, even if you know the falseness of the Shevuah, is Shevuos Ha'edos. Shevuos Ha'edos is the one case where we treat shogeg and mezid the same way. Maybe by Shevuos Ha'edos, if you do it, if you violate it by mezid, or you make the false shua b'mezid, you're chayiv once, but b'shogeg chayiv twice. Amar lahu lav haynu da'amri la'achos. Therefore, the pasuk says la'achos for one. Achos ata mechayvo v'ata mechayvo shtayim. There's only one level of liability. You're not chayiv two liabilities. V'i b'mezid mi gatarti. And if it was mezid, could there be two levels of liability? Rava Amar mishum dahavar davar shebechlal v'yatza lidon b'davar achadash. Because Shevuos Ha'edos ultimately was something that was included in the general klal of Shevuos. Now, ultimately, again, there's a chiddush. What's the chiddush? That shechayev for mezid, all you have is the chiddush. All you have is the chiddush. In other words, that unique aspect. Abaye savar isa l'shvua ba'olam. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Michlal, da Abaye savar isa shvua ba'olam. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi's 3 lines up. Well, it begins 4 lines up from the bottom. Ends of the 4th line up from the bottom. Savar isa l'shvua ba'olam. Kilomar. Isa l'shem Shevuos Bitoy be'eni yodea l'cha edos. So we'll say what seems to be interesting in all of this is that Abaye still seems to say that there's some element of Shevuos Bitoy in this case of Shevuos Ha'edos. V'haidelo mechayev tarti mishum miuta denata mechayev sham. Reading Rashi. And the only reason why you're not chayev twice, in the case of Shevuos Ha'edos, once for Shevuos Ha'edos, once for Shevuos Bitoy, is because of an exclusionary phrase. V'nafkamina hecha deisa lebitoy v'lesa le'edus ki yom psul le'edus. Okay, so therefore the Gemara says that phrase over here of Michlal Michlal da Abaye Savar Isa Shvuah Ba'olam makes it, the way the Rashi understands that phrase is, sounds like according to Abaye, there is an element of Shevuos Bitoy embedded in Shevuos Ha'edos. So yet Abaye agrees with Rav. If a person says, I say to Ruvain, I swear I don't know any eidos for you, and it turns out that he did not know. Eidos. So ultimately, again, because halacha l'maisa, it can't be phrased in the opposite way. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Hadar be Abaye mehahi. Abaye ultimately retracted this position. The other possibility is top of chavav. Chada minayu Rav Papa Amra. One of these statements wasn't made by Abaye, but instead one of these statements ultimately again was made by Rav Papa. Okay, so we'll say, so that brings to the end this sugya. So again, we're going to do one more piece in Meretz Hashem, then we'll tie up the loose ends of Shevuos Bitoy. Let's go back to Shmuel Omer, top of Chavav 26. Shmuel says as follows. Bishmal Omer, Eino Chayiv Ela Ala Asid Lavos. We'll say, remember again, if we go back to our Mishnah, the fundamental machlokes which existed in our Mishnah was Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Namely, Rabbi Shmuel said that Shevuos Bitui only exists in a prospective, future phrased Shvuah. Rabbi Akiva says, not true. It applies to all Shevuos, both prospective and retrospective. Says the Gemara, here we go, Tan Rabbanan, Lahara o Lehetiv. So remember again, this is all by Shevuos Bitoy. So the Torah used Lashon of Lahara or Lehetiv, you will swear. Now, the way that's literally translated is, one will swear Lahara for something good, or Lehetiv, right? Or for something bad, or Lehetiv for something beneficial. Now, that makes it sound like Shevuos Bitoy only devolves upon something that could really be demonstrably tov or ra. The Gemara said, but there's a whole other bucket of items in life which are neither tov or ra, they're just in the middle. So the Gemara says, she'ein ba hara v'atava, minayin, how do you know something that doesn't have hara v'atava? So we'll say, what's the example that doesn't have hara v'atava? So I'm going to eat a loaf of bread. There's no objective good or bad in that, right? As opposed to if you say, I swear I'm going to go ahead and hit Ruvain. I swear I'm going to go ahead and give Ruvain a matana. That could be hara or hatava. The Gemara is asking, how do I know that in the world of Shevuos Bitui, even what we'll call a pariv act, saying that's not hara v'hatava, could still create a binding Shevuos Bitoy? So I'll just point out over here, what's fascinating about this Gemara is the Musar Haskell in this is, it's only by Shevuos Bitoy that an action doesn't fit into the category of hara v'hatava. In the rest of life, as we go through our lives, everything we do fits into one category or another. I always used to say, like, there's only one place where you will find pariv, and that's in your kitchen, right? In the rest of life, it's either milchiks or fleishiks. Either what you're doing is good or it's not good. So apparently there are two categories. It's your kitchen and Shevuos Bitoy. Shevuos Bitoy, but I want to say this is very important. In our lives, in our day-to-day lives, there's no such thing as pariv. In other words, everything I'm doing is either advancing my personalistic cause or detracting from it. And literally every action and every decision in life fits into one of those two buckets. And as such, the most important thing in life is to be aware of that and therefore to choose wisely. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, but how do I know about Shevuos Bitoy, this pariv? It's pariv. There's something that's not hara or hatava. So how do I know that those things also are Shevuos Bitoy? Talmud Lomar, O nefesh ki sishava levate bisvasayim. Or if a person will swear, and again, it's really based on levate bisvasayim, means they articulate something, mere articulation. So any type of articulation, even if halacha l'maisa, again, it is not subject to hara v'hatava, ultimately is going to be subject to Shevuos Bitoy. So Amy ela lahaba. So furthermore, I only know that a Shevuos Bitoy is prospective, future oriented. I'm going to say, now again, let's just get these things nailed down. So how do I know that biblically paradigmatic Shevuos Bitoy is a future oriented, a future tense, a prospective Shua? Why? Because that's the way the pasuk phrases it. Lahara o lehetiv. to do something good or to do something bad. So it's phrased in the future. That's why I only know that a Shevuos Bitoy is future focused. The Gemara says, Emi Allahaba, Lisha'avar Minayin. How do I know that Shevuos Bitoy applies even retrospectively? Talmud Omar, L'chol asher yivata ha'adam b'shvua divrei Rabbi Akiva. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says a riboy. L'chol asher yivata adam. Whatever you articulate, whether you articulate future tense, past tense, doesn't matter. It's all called a Shevuos Bitoy. So we'll say all of this is Rabbi Akiva. So again, Shitas Rabbi Akiva is Shevuos Bitoy. Shevuos Bitoy is not just hara v'atava, but it's even parav. It's even parav. That's ultimately again based on nefesh kisi shava levate bisvasayim. Furthermore, although biblically paradigmatic Shevuos Bitoy is future, prospective focused, halacha l'maisa Shevuos Bitoy is also past tense, retrospective from the riboy as well. That's Rabbi Akiva. Beautiful. Rabbi Shmuel says, this is just our Mishnah. So this is Bryce just quoting our Mishnah. The Gemara quoting a brisa which mirrors our Mishnah. Rabbi Shmuel says, "Laharau lehitiv lahaba." Rabbi Shmuel says, no, not true. Laharau lehitiv ultimately again means only a prospective, future-oriented shvua is a Shevuos Bitoy. So the Gemara says, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva imkain emi eladvarim sheishban ha'tava v'hara. So again, Rabbi Akiva says, okay, Rabbi Shmuel, if you say, I understand what you're doing, right? In other words, Rabbi Shmuel's logic is very sound. Because what is Rabbi Shmuel saying? Look at the pasuk. What does the pasuk say? Lahara o lehitiv, which is future tense. So you see from here that only a prospective, future-oriented shvua is good. So Rabbi Akiva says, okay, but if that's the case, Rabbi Shmuel, I only know that you can make a shvua regarding things that are either bad or good, that literally fall into that category, one of those two categories. How do you know that you can make shvuos about things that are quote-unquote parav? How do you know that? Amarlo mi riboy hakasav. Oh, because Rabbi Shmuel says, listen, there's a riboy l'chol asher yivata adam misvasav. Whatever a person says could create the Shevuos Bitoy. So it says Rabbi Akiva to Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel, you agree with the riboy, right? You agree with the fact that there's an additional phrase that allows you to expand the scope of Shevuos Bitoy. If that's the case, in riba hakasav lekach, if the riboy is going to work to expand the scope of Shevuos Bitoy from lahara u'lehetiv to include other, we'll call it mundane things as well, then use the riboy to expand the scope of Shevuos Bitoy as well, to say that what? It doesn't just apply to future prospective Shevuos, but also applies to what? Past retrospective Shevuos. What a fantastic conversation. So the Gemara says, Shapir, Karma li Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva is saying good, right? He's saying good. He has a solid point about what he's saying to Rabbi Shmuel. Okay, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, so what's at the core of this machlokes? So we'll say, this is actually a really beautiful Gemara. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shmuel, so the Gemara says, really what's happening over here is as follows. Clearly, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel darshan the psukim in two dramatically different ways. So the Gemara says, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shmuel sheshimesh. We'll say, by the way, I just want to point out, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel are contemporaries. They're just to understand like who we're dealing with over here. They were both of the Asara Harugi Malchus. They were both tortured and executed by the Romans. So just we'll talk about more. I don't tell you, I'm trying to work on myself, especially like to try to actually make this a Daf Yomi shir and not a political commentary shir, a hashkafa shir. There's a lot to say on this Gemara. I'm going to save it, but just to understand, to have Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva on the same page of Gemara together, learning together, darshaning together, we'll say, this is Kodesh Kadashim. These people are of a different stratosphere. So watch this. This is even more incredible. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shmuel Sheshimesh. The Gemara says, what's at the core of the machlokes over here? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, so Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shmuel Sheshimesh is Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Shahaya. Okay. Rabbi Shmuel Sheshimesh is Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. So who is Rabbi Shmuel's Rebbe? His Rebbe was Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Now, boss, I want to point out something very interesting over here. If you notice, it doesn't say Rabbi Shmuel's Rebbe was Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, but rather, how does it phrase it? Sheshimesh. Shishimesh. So we'll say, so this is talking about the idea, we're all familiar with the Mishnah Pirkei Avos that says, Aseh l'charav. A person has to have a Rebbe. We all need a Rebbe, someone we look to in life. By the way, and Rebbe doesn't have to be necessarily someone we learn Torah from, but Rebbe is someone from whom you grow in life from. But if you look, this is fascinating. How does one establish a relationship with a Rebbe? And how does one learn from a Rebbe? Shimush. Shimush. Now, what does shimush mean, right? I don't know. You pick up the groceries, you take the car for an oil change. Like shimush sounds like serving, but shimush really means like a much deeper level of interaction, where there's an active involvement in the Rebbe's life, and the Rebbe has an active involvement in the Talmud's life. That's where that relationship comes from. It's incredible. So Rabbi Shmuel was Mishami Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Shahaya Dorish as Kol Torah beklalu prat. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, he had one exegetical principle one exegetical lens, through which he saw the entire Torah. What was that exegetical lens? Klalu prat. Now, I want to point out, remember, we say this every single morning, about the Yud Gimel Midos, Shar Torah, and the Dresha, and there are 13 exegetical principles. And I just want to point out, you do not have to choose one principle for the entire Torah. In fact, most opinions use multiple exegetical principles in different places. It happens to be that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana chose one. He was a klal uprat guy. And the way he darshan the Torah was klal uprat. This was who Rabbi Shmuel received his shimush from. This is who he learned by. Therefore, again, ihu nami dorish beklal uprat. If my Rebbe did it, I'm going to do it. It's so beautiful, right? So Rabbi Shmuel says, my Rebbe darshan with klal uprat, so I'm going to darshan with klal uprat. So we'll see how that plays out in just a moment. Rabbi Akiva, get ready for this. Who is Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe? Sheshimesh es Nachum ish gamzu. Wow. So I just want to point out how this opens worlds of understanding, right? Who is Nachum ish gamzu? So Nachum ish gamzu, gamzu latova, right? Nachum ish gamzu was the person ultimately, again, who was able to see. I mentioned this many times, right? We know the phrase gamzu latova. This is also for good. That comes from Nachum, the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva. Now remember, we tend to spiritually corrupt the concept of gamzu latova. We've spoken about this many times, right? What's gamzu latova? Gamzu latova is like what you say when you're miserable in life. Everything is terrible, but you still want to sound from, right? Gamzu latova, like you say it like a krachts, like you're half dead. Like gamzu latova, yeah, I'm sure it's great. Life is horrible. Life is terrible. It's ridiculous. But okay, I want to sound from, so I say gamzu latova. Gamzu latova is one of the most profound spiritual statements upon which the entirety of Yiddishkeit rests, which is the Ribono Shel Olam is good, and the Ribono Shel Olam loves us. Hakadosh Baruch Hu always takes care of us, and even when it's painful, and even when it's difficult, I believe with all of my heart, even if I can't wrap my mind around it, that somehow, some way, this is for the good. That was Nachum. That was Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe. Now, when you understand who Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe was, now you understand Rabbi Akiva. Now I understand that Rabbi Akiva was walking by the Kodesh HaKadoshim at the end of Maseches Makos, right? And everyone else is crying. And Rabbi Akiva is laughing. Why? Gamzu latova. And now I understand Rabbi Akiva as he's literally being tortured to death by the Romans. And says, the whole life I wondered, when am I going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha b'chol nafshecha? When will I be able to do it? That's Rabbi Akiva. Right? Gamzu latova. A Rabbi Akiva is not just born. A Rabbi Akiva is molded. A Rabbi Akiva is created. And who is created by? Obviously by himself, by his wife Rachel, but also by his Rebbe Nachum ish gamzu. When you understand where Rabbi Akiva comes from, suddenly the Rabbi Akiva personality makes so much more sense. Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe Nachum ish gamzu. It's incredible. And I will say, by the way, just to speak about Nachum ish gamzu, which we're not going to do now, is a whole shir by itself. Who was this person? And even so, Rabbi Akiva learned by Nachum ish gamzu. She'adorish is called Torah Kula beriba umiet. So again, Nachum ish gamzu, his exegetical principle of choice was a riboy and a miut. And therefore, ihu nami dorish priyumis. Everyone say, here we go. So now let's show. So now it turns out that the machlokes in Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva is about how to darshan the pasuk because they're both using a different exegetical lens. Rabbi Akiva is using ribui umiut, and Rabbi Shmuel is using klal uprat. So here we go. My Rabbi Akiva darshan. Let's start with Rabbi Akiva. What's Rabbi Akiva? Miut desanya o nefesh kisi shava riba. So when the pasuk says nefesh ki, right, person will swear, that's a ribui. Lahara u lehetiv. So again, for good or for bad, or for bad or for good, that's a mi'et. L'chala sheyivate adam chaz riba. Whatever a person will articulate, that's another ribui. So what do you have over here? Riba u mi'et v'riba. Now what happens when you have a ribui, a mi'ut, and a ribui? So the Gemara says riba hakol. That comes to include everything. It's marbe. It amplifies everything. So the Gemara says, my riba kol mili. What does it come to include? It comes to include that you can make a Shevuos bitoy about any topic, not just about hara ulehetiv, right? Hara ulehetiv, but about anything, even part of things. Or my mi'et. So what does it come to exclude? Mi'et dvar mitzvah. You can't make a Shevuos bitoy about a dvar mitzvah. Why not? Because you can't phrase it in the negative, right? I can say I will put on tefillin, but I can't swear that I won't put on tefillin. So that's the miut. So that's Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva's ribui miut comes to include everything. Everything means any topic, even part of ones, and also to include what? Both future tense and past tense. What's the miut? The miut is the dvar mitzvah. Good. Rabbi Shmuel darish klalu prat. Here we go. If a person will go ahead, right? Well, a person will articulate any shvua, klal, that's your klal. Lahara o lehetiv, that's your prat. L'chala sheyivate, anything you will articulate. L'chala sheyivate adam, chaz v'chaz. So I just want to point out, if you notice what's happening over here, they're dashing the same words. It's fascinating. They're dashing the same exact words. They're just using a different exegetical lens to darshan. So, what do you have? Klal uprat uklal. What do you do with the klal uprat uklal? So the Gemara says, klal uprat uklal, iyata dan elakeina prat. So ultimately, the klal is modified by the prat. Ma prat mefurash lahaba, af kol dahaba. Just like the prat, lahara u lehetiv, is future prospective, so too Shevuos bitoy is only future prospective. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Ahani klala la'asuya afilu dvarim she'in ban hara v'hatava lahaba." But ultimately, again, even according to Rabbi Shmuel, the klal also comes to include other things, mundane things, even things that don't fall into the category of hara v'hatava. Ahani prata. So the prat comes to go ahead and help lemeute afilu dvarim she'in ban hara v'hatava l'sha'avar, and the prat comes to exclude even hara v'hatava matters if phrased retrospectively. The Gemara says, Eifachana, so maybe switch this around. Yitzchak dumya de lahara o lehetiv. Mishi isura mishum bayachal dvaro. So again, Rabbi Yitzchak says it makes sense that everything resembles hara lehetiv, which tells me only things that are also because of bayachal dvaro, profaning your word. Yotza sazu shein isur mishum bayachal dvaro. Ela mishum bal tishakru. Rashi says over here, lo yachal dvaro. Rashi says, last white line in Rashi, lo mashma ela bedavar she'efshar lo lekayim shvuos avaynu la'aba. So again, in general, lo yachal dvaro seems to be focused on future-oriented things. Lo tishakru ultimately is focused on past tense things. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avin, Amar Kra, O nefesh kisi shava levate bisvasayim. Misha shvua, so Rabbi Yitzchak comes along and says like this, Misha shvua kodemes lebitui. That's only ultimately, again, where the shvua precedes the action. Bitui in this context means the action. So the Gemara says, Velosha bitui kodemes l'shvua. But not that the action precedes the shvua, which means what? Shevuos bitui only applies to a case where the shvua precedes the action, which means what? Future prospective Shevuos, not to a case where the action precedes the Shvuah, which is retrospective Shevuos bitui. The Gemara says, Yatsa za'achalti v'lo achalti, shamaisa kodem l'Shvuah. Okay, so Rabbi Yitzchak is siding with Rabbi Shmuel that Shevuos bitui is only future, not past tense. Incredible. Tana Banan. All right, so now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa, and now this brisa ultimately again is going to go ahead and go more into depths of Shevuos bitui. So we'll say before we go on, how do we paskin? Because this is killing us. This is killing us, right? Well, I can't go on anymore. Right? So what do we do? What do we do with Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva? Because this is big. This gets to the core of Shevuos bitui. So once again, now the beauty about this, I will say, is now I feel like we know everything about Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, right? So Rabbi Shmuel ultimately, again, is darshaning klalu pratu klal, and therefore what that yields is Shevuos Bitui is only lahaba, only future-oriented, no retrospective past tense Shevuos Bitui, but ultimately, again, the Riboy does come to say that it doesn't just include Hara al-Hativ, it also includes mundane stuff. Rabbi Akiva, Darshan Riboy Umiut, it comes to teach you that Shevuos Bitui applies both future and past, and also agrees that it doesn't just include the Hara al-Hativ, it even includes mundane items. How do we paskin? Rambam says, Hilchos Shevuos, Perek Aleph, Halacha Beis, Mamish, the beginning of Hilchos Shevuos, V'ein Shevuos Bitui, no Haggis, here it is, Ela B'dvarim She'ef Shalo La'asosan, Bein Lahaba, Bein L'Sha'avar. Rambam passes like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, so we'll say, so Shevuos Bitui can be phrased both, or I should say, in order for something to be a Shevuos Bitui, it must have the ability to be phrased both prospectively, future tense, and retrospectively. Now, the Rambam doesn't say it explicitly, but it's clear it also has to be able to be phrased both in the positive and the negative. Shevuos Bitui has to be something that I could phrase as, I can do this, or I can't do this, or I will do this, or I won't do this. So again, you need two requirements. Number one, phrased in positive and negative. Number two, be able to be phrased both in past and future tense. Good. So halacha l'maisa. There's more to say about that, but we're not actually finished with the sugya yet. But first, let's go on ultimately to the brisa. So halacha l'maisa. Just keep it on the belt. We pass like Rabbi Akiva. Incredible. Tanabanon. Here we go. Says the Gemara. Tanabanon. So here we go. Ha'adam b'shvua. So again, I will say, just to tell you the positive the Gemara is quoting, the pasuk is, "O nefesh kisi shava levate b'sasayim." This is our pasuk by Shevuos Bitui. If a person will swear, articulation with his lips, lahara o lahativ, l'chol asher yivata ha'adam b'shvua. Anything that a person will articulate with a shvua. So now the Brisa Darshans, ha'adam b'shvua. What does this come to include? Prat or exclude prat la'ones. This comes to exclude an extenuating circumstance. Okay, well, we'll see what this means. V'ne'elam, and he forgot about his shvuah. So again, Rabbi said the paradigmatic case of liability ultimately, again, for Shevuos Bitui is where I made a shvuah, and then what? I forgot about my shvuah and transgressed it. V'ne'elam, so that comes to prat lamezid. This comes to exclude someone who intentionally violates his shvuah. Mimenu, from him, shenis alma mimenu shvuah. He forgot about the shvuah. You might have thought that maybe he remembered the shvuah, but he forgot about the object that he swore about. Talmud Lomar, b'shvuah v'ne'elam. There's only liability al he'elam shvuah hu chayiv, ve'eno chayiv al he'elam chayfetz. You're only chayiv for a lapse of awareness about the shvuah, but not chayiv for a lapse of awareness about the object you swore about. Now, what exactly that means, we'll see. Now, we'll say, now we're going to dissect the brisa. Very exciting. Onar. So when we say Adam b'shvuah, that comes to exclude a case of ones. What's ones? Hey chidami. So we'll say this is a great case. Kid Rav Kana Ravasi. Watch this. Rav Kana Ravasi. Kiavokaimi. I was in the second wide line 26 Echafav Medalef. Kiavokaimi mikamei derav. Amar Mar. So let's listen to this. Rav Kana Ravasi were in Rav's shir. So they heard a shir by Rav, and afterwards you can imagine they're chazering it. And what happened? Mar Amar. Shvuasa dahachi amarav. Umar Amar Shvuasa dahachi amarav. So I'll say what happened. So they're chazering over shir, and they have a disagreement about what Rav said. So one of them said, I swear Rav said this. And the other one says, I swear Rav said this. So they both took a Shevuos Bitui, a declarative shvuah, about what Rav said. Now what happened? Now obviously, Rav came, right? They came back to Rav, and Rav discerned one of them was right and one of them was wrong. So we'll say, so about the guy that was wrong, so the one who was wrong said to Rav, Rabbi, did I swear falsely? Your heart literally again took advantage of you, right? Your heart put you in a compromised position, which is another way of saying, Rashi says, Libcha anascha, kisavar hayis l'shav. No, you thought you were right. This is not, in other words, I will say, ultimately again, when a person is convinced about the fact that they are swearing correctly, that's not the Shevuos sheker, and ultimately, again, it's not a Shevuos bitui. That's not our case, right? That's not our case. So when a person is convinced that what they are doing is right and acts accordingly, that ultimately, again, is called an ones. Now, halacha l'maisa will have to see exactly what we do with this case, right? Because that would seem to disqualify, like a lot of cases are like that, where a person thinks they're doing the right thing, but they're doing the wrong thing, that there's no liability in that case. In fact, we'll say, by the way, generally, that's what we call shogeg, right? When a person thinks they're doing the right thing, but in fact they're mistaken. So again, we'll see halacha l'maisa what to do about this by Shevuah. Okay, but let's go weiter. So I will say, but that phrase of libcha anascha, that when you think you're doing the right thing, but it turns out you did something wrong, there may not be liability in that case. Next, v'ne'ela mimenu. And again, so we'll say, so in this case over here, I made a Shevuos bitui, and then ultimately, again, I forgot about the Shevuah and transgressed it. So shenis'ali mimenu Shevuah. I forgot about the Shevuah, I transgressed it. That's when there will be liability. Yochel shenis'ali mimenu chayfetz. You want to thought, what about, we'll say, if I remember the Shevuah, but I forgot about the chayfetz. Now, let's take a simple case. I swear I won't eat the loaf of bread. Okay, so a case of Helam Shevuah is obvious, right? I forgot that I made the Shevuah, I ate the loaf of bread. Now the Gemara says, what about a case where you remember the Shevuah, but for some reason you forgot about the object? So the Gemara says, what is the case? So the Gemara says, so they laughed at this ruling in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because they said Shevuah mishkachas la below chayfetz. So I understand Helam Shevuah. What's the case of Helam Shevuah? Kigom da'amar Shevuah shelo ochal paschitin v'kasavar sha'achol ka'amar the Shevuah se inshi chef tzedakir. So you're going to say, for example, this is an interesting case. I swear I'm not going to eat a loaf of bread, and then what happens? I eat a loaf. Why? Because I forgot that I made a Shevuah not to eat. I thought I made a Shevuah to eat. To eat. So that could be a case of Helam Shevuah. That's even more dramatic, right? Not only did I forget my Shevuah, in other words, I forgot the Shevuah that I made and I thought I made a different one. So again, I know, so that's the case of Helam Shevuah. Ela chayfetz below Shevuah hechi dami. But how do you ever have a case of where you forget about the object, but you remember the Shevuah? So perhaps, kigon damar Shevuah shelo ochal paschit. And for an example, maybe I swore I'm not going to eat wheat bread. And what happens? Right? And I thought that I made a neder about barley bread. Okay, so the Gemara says, in that case, I remember the Shevuah, right? But I forgot about the object. But understand, it's all called Helam Shevuah. That's in Eretz Yisrael, they mocked this. What are you talking about? A distinction between Helam Shevuah and Helam Chayfetz, where I forget about the Shevuah, I forget about the object. If you forget about the object, what are you effectively forgetting about? The Shevuah. In other words, there's no independence here between the object and the Shevuah. If, for example, again, I swore I wasn't going to eat wheat bread, and I thought I said barley bread, so I ended up eating wheat bread, so again, that means I forgot about the Shevuah. That's not called Helam Chayfetz. Amar Belazar, David Da'achas. Belazar says, you're right. There's really no distinction between forgetting about the Shevuah and forgetting about the object. The object and the Shevuah are by definition intertwined. So Maskav Rabbi Yosef, Alma, Chayfetz below Shula Mishkachasla. So you're telling me again, you can't have a case where you forget about the object but didn't forget about the Shevuah? I'll give you a case. Go and listen to this. And here's the case. I swear I'm not going to eat wheat bread. And I remember my Shevuah. I have a basket of bread. In the basket, there's barley loaves and there's wheat loaves. So I know that I swore not to eat a loaf of wheat bread. I put my hand into the basket in order to take a barley loaf, and I end up pulling out a wheat loaf. And again, I thought it was a barley loaf. And I ate it. In this case, I fully remember my Shevuah. I know that I'm not allowed to eat a wheat loaf. And my intention was not to take a wheat loaf, it was to take a barley loaf. But I ended up taking the wrong loaf. So the Shevuah say dachile, chefzahu de lo yadale. I didn't know the chefza. So this would seem to be a good case of where I absolutely unequivocally remember my Shevuah, but I forgot the helam, the lapse of awareness is about the object. Amar le Abaye, Klum mechayves le carbon ella amai detafis le biadei helam shvuahu. Abai says, at the end of the day, what's driving carbon? You're right. So you'll be chayiv now a carb olev yored. What's driving that carbonic liability? What's driving it? A mistake about the shvuah. In other words, at the end of the day, it's not the bread that drives carbonic liability, it's the shvuah. Now, granted, the mistake I made over here is that I thought I was eating a barley loaf, but really I ate a wheat loaf. But what are the ramifications of eating a wheat loaf? I'm in violation of my shvuah. So in other words, this notion of splicing the object from the shvuah, it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy. It doesn't work. So the Gemara is lish nachri. Not another possibility is Amar le'abai Rabbi Yosef. Sof carbon the kamaisi Allah. Alternate version of the phraseology of Rabbi says Rabbi Yosef. At the bottom line, you're right. You're gonna have to bring a shuas b'ita. So I'll say, I swear I'm not gonna. Here's the case again. Same case. I swear I'm not gonna eat a loaf of wheat bread. I'm not gonna eat wheat bread. So what happens? I put my hands in the basket. I know in there I have barley loaves and wheat loaves. My intention is to take a barley loaf. I think I have a barley loaf. I eat it. It turns out to be a wheat loaf. So okay. So now the Gemara says there's liability. So sof Abai says carbon de kamai sialei de pas mias helam shvuahu. Why do you bring a carbon? Not because of the loaf, or because of the loaf, but because why? Because the loaf compromised the shvuah. In other words, at the end of the day, all roads lead back to lapse of awareness on shvuah. Rav Yosef Amar L'cha, Rav Yosef will say, Kevan dechiyadale dechitin hu parish mine helam chayvetzu. Rav Yosef will say, no, it's not called a lapse of awareness about the shvuah. Why? Because I remember my shvuah. The lapse over here is about the type of loaf. V'harai, if someone were to tell me, hey, Silber, put that down, that's a wheat loaf, I would say, or it's a wheat loaf, I'd put it down immediately, and again, I wouldn't eat it. That shows at the end of the day that really what's happening over here is a lapse of awareness about not the shvuah, but about the object. So I will say, it seems to be the majority opinion is, and it makes sense, that creating this distinction between helam shvuah and helam chayfetz doesn't make sense. Right? Because either way, at the end of the day, when there is liability, it's because I violated the shvuah. Whether I violate the shvuah because I forget about the shvuah, or I have a misunderstanding about the object, bottom line, it's violation of the shvuah itself, which drives carbonic liability. So, Rav Nachman, helam zev biyado mahu. What happens if you have a lapse of awareness about both? You forgot about everything, right? You have a lapse of awareness about the shvuah, lapse of awareness about the object. What happens in a case like that? There's a lapse of awareness about the shvuah in that case, and therefore there's liability. But there should be a lapse of awareness about the object, and I should be pater. We look, if you would be reminded that he took a shvuah and he would stop what he's doing, that's called a helam shvuah, and therefore he's chayiv. But if he would stop as a result of being reminded about the nature of the object, that's lapse of awareness about the object. Klum pirish mishvuah ela mishum chayvetz. Klum pirish michayvetz ela mishum shvuah. Again, I will say in general, so what Rav Ashi wants to suggest is that they're intertwined. Someone will only stop because of the shvuah, right? If they're reminded about the chayvetz and about the chayvetz, about the shvuah. In other words, once again, these objects are intertwined. To divide them seems to be a halachic fiction. Ela mishum shvuah, the Gemara says mishum shvuah, ela lo shna. Rather, I will say there is no distinction. The Gemara wants to suggest over here. Now, again, this is going according to the opinion. So, okay, let's take a step back over here. So I'll say, here's what we know. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, if the lapse of awareness is about the shvuah, ultimately, again, there's carbonic liability. So I swear that I'm not going to eat this loaf of bread. And then I forget about the shvuah, and I eat a loaf of bread. Simple case. What about if you remember the shvuah, but there's what's called helam chayfetz? I forget about the object. How could I forget about the object? I know it's a loaf of bread. I thought it was barley. And it turns out that it was wheat, and I consume it. Is there carbonic liability in that case? The Brisa says no. What we begin to see over here is that there's machlokes about that. So according to the Brisa, therefore, wherever there is helam chayfetz, the ambiguity or the lapse of awareness is about the object. I have complete awareness about the shvuah, lack of awareness or lapse of awareness about the object. The Brisa says no liability in that case. Yet we just saw a whole school of thought that says that's ridiculous. Lapse of object is the same thing of lapse of Shevuos. It's the same thing. So again, Brisa says only chayav for lapse of awareness about the Shevuah, not chayav for lapse of awareness about the object. And that's how the Gemara ends off over here. Now again, how that works, we'll see. So 2 open items so far. Number 1, what you do in the case of ones. Ones, right? I literally thought I was swearing truthfully, and it turns out that I swear falsely. What's the halacha in that case? That's open item number 1. Open item number 2, if there is helam chayfetz, I know full well about the shvuah, but I forgot about the object. Let's learn about the object. Is there liability? Open item number 2. Hold on to it until tomorrow. Let's go. We got to turn the page. Says the Gemara. Boy, me Rav Nachman. Next, Rav Nachman. The following kasha. Amud Beis. Ezehu shigigas shvuas bitu l'sha'avar. What's the case? Ultimately, again, of a shigigas shvuas bitu l'sha'avar. Rashi says, "Kevan de ba'inan adam b'shvua heichem ishkachas l'shogeg." What would be a case of an accidental violation of a retrospective shvuas bitui? So the Gemara says, "Idi yada mezitu." So, for example, we'll say, "I swear I did not eat a loaf of bread today." So it'll be the case of shogeg. If halacha l'maisa, again, I know at the time of the shua that I did eat a loaf of bread, then I'm amazed. Right? So the Gemara says, "Ida lo yada." If I did not know, in other words, let's say really I thought I know I ate a loaf of bread, but I was positive that's what? It was barley. So I swear I did not eat a loaf of wheat bread today, right? And I was positive that it was barley. That's ones. Amrlei ba'omer yodea ani sheshvua zu asura aval ini yodea im chayaven ala karban olav. So this is very interesting. So Gemara says, what's the case of shogeg? Case of shogeg is like this, where I say I know ultimately again that this shvua is asura, but I don't know about the liability. I don't know, is the liability ultimately again a karban or not? So we'll say ultimately again, there's a lack of awareness about liability. This goes kiman kimunvaz da amar shigagas karban shma shkaga. Munvaz is of the opinion of Osai that the only time something is considered to be mazid is not only if you know what you're doing, but ultimately again if you know the liability for your act. But if you're unsure about liability, that is relegated to the status of shogeg. Quite amazing. So the Gemara says, Furthermore, again, Abba says, even reflect the view of the Rabbanon. Why? Because the Rabbanon only argue on munbaz in the rest of Torah. Right? Ultimately, again, by every other chi of chatos. But in the case of shuas bitui, whereas a chidishu, the b'chala Torah kula lo ashkechan lav the maisi karban the afina me avol zara. In general, again, I will say, why is Shevuos bitui unique? Shevuos bitui unique is because, in general, you never find a case of a lav that has a chi of chatos, a chi of karban. Generally, again, what do you get for a lav? Malchus, right? Shevuos bitui is the only case of a lav that comes with liability for a karban. That's so again, the Gemara says, the afina me avol zara. Because general carbonic liability is learned out from avodah zara, right? That's where you learn out carbonic liability from, not from a lav. So the Gemara says, "Havahacha maisi," but here, in the case of shuas bitui, ultimately again you will bring a carbon. Therefore, afilu rabban amodus. Therefore, Rabbi says it's possible. Just an interesting point over this. The Gemara is suggesting over here that maybe the case of shigagas Shevuos bitui l'sha'avar. So a very specific case. Shigagas Shevuos bitui l'sha'avar is a case where a person knows what he's doing, but didn't know liability. And again, Munvaz is of the opinion that says that it's called shogeg when you don't know what your punishment is. And even though normally the Rabbanim disagree with Munvaz, that's only by all of the cases in the Torah. But by Shevuos bitui, they'll agree with Munvaz. Why? Because Shevuos bitui is unique. How is Shevuos bitui unique? Because we never find another case of a lav that is going to be chayev a karban. So because of this unique case, even the Rabbanan will agree with Munvaz that if someone commits an act with intentionality but doesn't know the liability for that act, that is still called Shomi. We'll have to stop over. We're not finished. We're not finished the case. We have a lot of open items in Me'at Hashem for tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll finish up the sugya. We'll get clear resolution on all of these items. Halach l'maisa on Shevuos Vita. Tomorrow Rosh Chodesh. Tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. Me'at Hashem Chazara Seder 5:35 a.m. That Yomi starts in Me'at Hashem at 5:45. Shachar is 6:30. Shkayach, everyone. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day.
I was surprised to hear Rabbi Shmuel's Rabbi was not going to be a car because his body is missing. You often find without question. Tell me, Rabbi Shmuel, what is the halacha according to your